It's so exciting to be here and so exciting to hear about your projects, although I'm very impressed by the scale of collecting and think you guys must have the most amazing stores in the UK. We're absolutely jammed. So something to think about. So Wayne asked me to talk a little bit about the collecting context, or the policy context for collaborative collecting in the UK. So mine's reflecting a little bit more on the policy. So the growing emphasis in UK museum policy on the potential of our institutions to deliver social justice provides both opportunities and threats to our practice, especially in terms of the focus of this workshop on collaborative collecting. The social turn is now firmly established in museum practice, and any questions about the actual ability of our clunky, bureaucratic, historically grounded and chronically underfunded buildings and collections to fulfill this agenda are resolutely brushed under the carpet. One would think that the harsh climate of austerity, the constant toll of museum closures and cuts being wearily recorded by the UK's Museums Association would have us returning to an emphasis on our core functions of caring for collections of material and visual culture, and of creating safe and stimulating spaces for our publics to encounter them. Instead, the slow retreat of government finances from cultural heritage institutions in the UK has been met by an increasingly noisy insistence on their centrality to delivering governmental regimes around social inclusion. And echoes of this insistence can be found in many places, including in the aims of the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is one of the biggest funders of heritage in the UK. Also the Arts Council of England, the government body responsible for the sector. But it reaches its apogee in a vision document which was released with much fanfare by the Museums Association in July 2013, just as the cuts were beginning to bite. Museums Change Lives constitutes the UK Museums Association's vision for the increased social impact of museums. It, I quote, demonstrates that museums can be ambitious about their role in society. All museums, however they are funded and whatever their subject matter, can support positive change. And clearly this document was intended to preserve what scant public funding it could for the sector. As it notes, and again I quote, as public expenditure continues to be cut, it's more important than ever to have a strong sense of social purpose. Funders and policymakers expect museums to achieve greater social outcomes and impact. But in what I believe making only a tenuously grounded claim for successful social engineering by museums, the vision risks signing the sector up to a strategy which it is poorly equipped and insufficiently resourced to deliver. This vision document has 10 principles. I'll give you a moment to have a look at those. Huge, huge things. It's a small document, but with a lot of principles. I think the principles seem appropriate enough, but what the document fails to do is to ground these firmly in the buildings and especially the collections we care for. And with this, the risk happens that the debate slips away from us and we risk becoming places of rhetoric rather than meaning, of action without the resources for reflection, for all the problems they create, not only in their awkward storage and conservation demands, but also in their historical prejudices, biases and omissions. Collections must be the site, the contact zone in which these principles are enacted. And in these times of austerity, it's for the care and preservation of these that we must fight. So this is something that concerns me deeply, that the emphasis on this social term without the resources to actually care for our capital. So I'm just going to briefly outline quite a small collaborative collecting project that I'm engaged in at my institution, Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, which is in the southeast of the UK, which is seeking to enact these principles within the context of a specific collection. So Brighton Museum, it's a local government-run museum service, and such museums form about 30% of the UK museum sector. Its World Art collection, which is designated as being of national importance, includes about 13,000 objects from Africa, Asia, the Pacific and Americas, most acquired in the period 1860 to 1940, so very much largely within an imperial or colonial framework. The section's got a long-established interest in working with stakeholders of the collection, whether via local diaspora groups, a city-based Hindu women's group, individuals of dual heritage, or informal groups, such as recently one of Iranian students. But we also work with those outside Europe and the UK, including on the Burma-China border. In the past, these projects tended to be museum-initiated and driven, often short-term in focus and rarely sustained. But recent scholarship on participation in museums in the UK, such as I don't know how well this report's translated across Europe, but this report by Bernadette Lynch for the Paul Hamlin Foundation has been quite significant in the UK, and it found that despite the numerous examples of groundbreaking innovative practice, the funding invested in public engagement and participation in UK museums has, and I'm quoting, not significantly succeeded in shifting the work from the margins to the core of these organisations. And also recent work by Helen Graham of Leeds University on participative decision-making on heritage, such as this report, which came out this year. This scholarship on participation in museums has caused us to reflect on our well-meaning but ultimately self-serving initiatives, and to consider how, in the climate of more limited resources and chronic short-termism, we can contribute to building capacity and a sense of cultural ownership amongst our stakeholder communities. So at Brighton, in the World Arts section, the first step to this end was a pilot series of meetings of a new BME, nasty acronym for Black and Minority Ethnic, our BME Heritage Network. Some consultancy work funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund to increase applications to its schemes by BME groups and individuals have resulted in a blossoming of small-scale, diverse heritage projects in the city. And the network was created to provide a means of sharing advice, learning and resources. The museum created the forum, provided a space and refreshments, and funded a facilitator, Sarah Naomi Lee, who's pictured. But the museum took the role for once of participant and joined the discussion table rather than heading it. The meetings were incredibly well attended and positively received. This is actually the final showcase event where people are pitching their project ideas to members from other cultural heritage agencies. One of the meetings of the group, some time was given over to an evaluation of Brighton Museum. The ensuing discussion made for sometimes uncomfortable listening for museum staff present. Perhaps inevitably, representation was a key concern, both in terms of museum staffing as well as in its collections and displays. So here's perhaps quotes that we might be familiar with. But even more so was a clear desire for meaningful participation in museum decision-making. And more fundamentally, I really like this quote, we can't take ourselves out of the equation. We have to be part of the process. So our response to this was the project we're currently engaged in. One of the World Arts collection's strengths is its historic holdings of textiles from West Africa, particularly Nigeria and Sierra Leone. Again, largely collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these pieces reflect both prestigious textile traditions as well as a colonial interest in the opportunities for trade. As with much of the World Art collection, there have been few additions to the collection post-1950. And we're currently working on an exhibition on contemporary African fashion, Fashion Cities Africa, which opens next year. And this focus on urban metropolitan fashion in African cities still left a significant gap in the collection, one which prevented any reflection on the impact of the huge social, cultural, political and economic changes that swept the African continent with independence in the 1960s. And a survey of other UK museums suggested there was no museum in the UK which could speak in a coherent way to this theme. So we were able to get some funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund's Collecting Cultures scheme, an award of £240,000, 325,000 euros, half of which has to be spent on acquisitions, which reflect, in our case, changing practices of fashion and dress in African countries in the period 1960 to 2000. And a key element was creating a collecting panel who would be responsible for making decisions about what would be acquired. So we've had just 2 meetings of the panel and debate at both. It's very difficult in a picture of a meeting, but the debate and the energy has been incredible. There are 10 panel members plus museum staff. Panel members are specialists in the field of African fashion, sometimes through their academic research and sometimes through personal experience. And the panel includes a British professor of human geography and a South African charity volunteer who lives in a homeless shelter. The panel, the terms on which the award was made were incredibly broad, and the panel have decided to take a strategic but not representative approach, which will provide comment on the omissions and prejudices of the existing collection. Themes they're currently exploring include the macro-political, Pan-Africanism, struggles for independence, as well as the intimate, hair, skin, beauty. And despite being pummeled with information about the restrictions that govern our collecting practices, whether on grounds of funds, conservation, storage, export legality or ethics, panel members are demonstrably excited, engaged and confident about their ability to deliver this new resource. So it's a small case study, but with arguably big ramifications for how my institution engages stakeholders and enables genuine participation in decision-making. Most importantly, as a collections-focused project, it's based in and responds directly to something tangible, meaningful, enduring. Furthermore, in creating a space for a group of citizens in the context of the UK to enact their right to be involved in decision-making within a publicly funded organisation, it's also opening new debates about what it might have meant to be a citizen within emergent, independent African countries in the second half of the 20th century. Thank you.